Welcome to the Social Movements Lab. My name is Michael Hardt, and with Sandro Mezzadra, we direct the Social Movements Lab. The lab is oriented in part towards really introducing individual struggles that are going on in the world, with each of our sessions interviewing either participants or really scholar activists that are engaged in the struggle. In fact, throughout the course of the lab, this figure of the scholar activist has become central for us, and partly which when we mean not so much that students or professors go involved in the struggle, but really that there's a high level of intellectual discourse and even scholarly activity, that production of concepts that comes from the activists themselves. So in addition to each session introducing and delving into a particular struggle, we also intend for the series of lab sessions to pose links among the struggles and a way of thinking about struggles that are going on in the world together. The lab started at Duke University's Franklin Humanities Institute, and now we're very grateful that Red May has hosted the struggle. Hosted the lab. You might, if you're interested in these kinds of things, you might check out the Red May YouTube channel, which has a lot of interesting material. The lab's also supported by Dinamopress and EuroNomade. Before we get to today's session, I just wanted to say that after the 20th of December, we'll be also posted our next lab session, which will be about abortion access struggles in Mexico. Very successful struggles, and the interlocutors for the lab that are joining us are Amy Kraus and Oriana Lopez Uribe. So that will be on December 20th, and then available from that time on the YouTube channel. Our interlocutors today will first be talking with Paola Rivetti, who is normally in Dublin, but today we're being joined with her from Rome. And then in the second half hour, we'll join the discussion Frieda Afary, who is currently in the Bay Area but normally in Los Angeles. Please look at the side of the YouTube page for Paola's and Frieda's biographies and links to their other work. So I think then it's I think then we can get started. And I wanted to start, Paola, as always, we can't assume that everyone watching has followed the struggles as much as we have, and it'd be good to give a first introduction to the events in Iran, maybe even first with the spark that set off the current protests, and then some idea of the way that they've developed over the last few months. Could you start that way?
Sure. Thank you, Michael and Sandro, for hosting us. I think it's a great opportunity to discuss and to exchange ideas. So as we probably all know by now, the sparkle that actually set on fire, really, this protest movement, or this revolution, as the protesters are asking us to call it, happened 2.5-3 months ago. We're in mid-September, when a young Kurdish Iranian woman, Gina Mahsamini, was taken into custody by the the morality police, and then 3 days later, is what we know is that she's in hospital in a coma and dies. So this is really the moment when the month-long attention that the brutality of the morality police had already attracted by the Iranian population and within the Iranian national public debate really changes into something much more political and much more mobilizing really the masses and this discontent that had been mounting already for months. But I would say, so the first protests actually take place in front of the hospital in Tehran, where Gina Mahsamini is. But the real whole transformation of this protest movement into a national protest movement takes place when the corpse of Gina Massamini is brought back to Sargez, which is the town where she is from, in the Iranian area of, in the Kurdish area of Iran. And that's where, for the first time during a funeral, we have women taking off their hijab and chanting the today famous slogan, Jinji Hanazadi, which translates into woman, life, freedom in Kurdish. So I think there are, of course, a lot of specific aspects to this protest movement, which makes it salient to this, the specific Iranian cultural, social, and political context. But the way in which I see these protests and this movement is very much in line with other global processes that I think we have been witnessing in the past months, which whereby on the one side we have the resurgence with, I think, new radicality in terms of action, but also intellectual production of feminist movements, which try to really build a political space for action at the intersection of different structures of oppression and try to practice as much as they can genuinely intersectionality on the one side, and on the other side we have the I would say opposite, but I think it's only apparently contradictory process of the political and electoral success of neo-fascist movements or the populist radical right, or or how you want to call it, which has been enjoying political success and increasing electoral successes. And here I'm thinking, of course, it's quite easy to think of Bolsonaro, Trump, but also I'm thinking of Modi in India, more recently Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So I think what is happening in Iran is of course specific, context specific, but is very much intertwined with this kind of larger global struggles, which actually puts reproductive justice and access to reproductive rights, which also means the capacity of self-determination and the freedom of choice. Although choice, I think it's a problematic term because of the cultural kind of values that it mobilizes, but that puts all these different issues very much at the center of their mobilizations and of the struggle itself. So I of course think that there are, of course, very specific cultural and political aspects. As we all know, this movement is a movement that has taken shape around the compulsory hijab, so the obligation that women have since the early 80s to cover themselves and to have a specific dress code, let's call it this way. But it has at the same time been able to I think build connections and different intersections with other movements and other demands for freedom. Something we were just mentioning before, which of course I think is very important, is the ethnic/racial justice element, being Gina Massamini, a young Kurdish Iranian woman of Kurdish origin, or Kurdish woman. But we have also seen other expression of intersectionality, I think, in the course of this, 2.5 months, almost 3 months, when it comes to, for instance, let's say, queer politics, and also when it comes to intersecting various issues related to economic justice and class politics.
That's super interesting, and I wanted to come back to both the transversal aspects that you mentioned about these convergences or links, and also the international aspects. But before that, Paola, could you give a little bit more idea about the social composition of the struggles and the extent and even some of the numbers, of just arrested, killed, that sort of thing. But even starting with the social composition, the age, the age of people that are these, since it starts in a and it's somewhat takes place on a feminist terrain, as you say. Is it is it majority young women, or is it equally men and women? The extent throughout the country. Can you give some idea of both the composition and scale?
Yeah, so I would just like to start with a couple of, some data about how many people have died because of state repression and being arrested. So we're looking at a situation where we have over 400 victims. And over 14,000 people being arrested, and these are very likely extremely conservatory. Estimations which are conservative. So it's very likely that numbers are much higher than these. We are also looking at a situation where the judges and the judiciary system has decided to issue death sentences against people who have been arrested during the protests. And we're also looking at a situation where in these very days what we have is the Iranian army and some troops of the Revolutionary Guards Corps being deployed in the Kurdish area of Iran, according to state authorities, to combat against separatist forces, armed groups and armed forces. But what we know from, independent human rights organization and their report is that the military violence is actually exerted on unarmed civilians. And this is all taking place while the same actions are carried out by the Turkish army in northeast Syria, in Rojava. So this is a movement that of course, has a national, let's put it this way, dimension, but also transnational and international, quite clearly, dimension. In terms of the composition of the protests and the kind of entity of the protests, I'm referring here to some data published by Azam Khatam, who's a political geographer who published I think it was a couple of weeks ago, an article on a website called PE Critique, Political Economy Critique, which is a great resource. You might want to, to check it out. And what she estimated is that 15% of the young urban population has taken part or is taking part in the protest. 5% of the adult urban population is taking part in the protest. We're looking at about 150 cities and towns where we had episodes of contention and mobilizations, for a total, Azam Khatam estimates, a total of 2 million people. And she's also emphasizing the cross-class composition of the movement, which she deduces from an analysis of what neighbors in different cities, especially in big cities like Tehran, for instance, but not exclusively, what neighbors within big cities have mobilized and in which neighbors we had mobilizations. So this seem. These numbers do not seem particularly big, but actually they are. If we, for instance, consider that it is estimated that 2% of the population took place in the '79 revolution, so it's just a data to kind of give you an idea of what's the entity of the phenomenon we're looking at. And in terms of the social composition of the current protests, we have seen. Both in terms of, we have seen I think a display of diversity, both in terms of geographical diffusion and spreading of the protests. As we know, geographically peripheral areas it's not a coincidence, mostly inhabited by linguistic and ethnic minorities, have definitely been participating in this movement. We know that also in terms of class composition, we have seen different segments of the population mobilizing and organizing in support and around the demands of this movement, which for the moment, we don't have a list of demands. So for the moment, are kind of in this kind of expansive phase, if we can call it that way. So we have seen the workers of the oil sector mobilizing, the precarious workers, casualized workers of the oil sector mobilizing. We have had the teachers and their informal / illegal trade union organizing, mobilizing the members. We have seen bus drivers also supporting the strikes of the oil workers and the protest movement. So we have seen university staff, so professors protesting side by side with student organizations within the different universities across the country. So we had, comparatively speaking, we are looking at a movement that is much more diverse. I would like here to stress something, which is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is the fact that I think it's very important to emphasize that this is a specific moment in this movement. So it's a sort of expansive moment where the movement is able to include different demands and different struggles, which have different genealogies and specific genealogies. It doesn't mean that what we are looking at is a feminist future. It doesn't mean that what we are looking at is an is a political subject that is able to produce and act upon the intersectionality it produces. So there's a lot that is still, that still has to happen before we actually get to, feminist, anti-patriarchal, intersectional, emancipatory futures of liberation. This is valid for I think this movement in Iran right now, and this is valid for many other movements. I mean, across the world, of course, Iran is not, it's not an exception. But I think we have some grounds and reasons to be optimistic, in the sense that this is, after many years, I think this is one of probably the most diverse movements we have had. Mass movement we have had in the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paola. From this point of view, can you expand a bit more on what you called before ethnic and racial justice issues within the movement? This has to do, of course, with the question of minorities. You mentioned the Kurdish issue. But it has to do also with the way in which the Iranian people as such is conceived and represented. Is there within this movement an attempt to go beyond the traditional kind of understandings of the Iranian people as a Persian people, as a people which is kind of dominated by the Persian element?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sandro. I think it's difficult to strike a balance between the optimism I was talking about before and the avoiding romanticizing basically this movement. I think and this is why I was stressing the fact that between what we are seeing and what we are, all these expressions of intersectionality and an actual, as you put it, an actual awareness and conscious attempt at going beyond the, the current limitations there's a lot to be, there's a lot has to happen. So I think that I mean, it's pretty difficult because we don't have as probably, I should have mentioned before, but there's no entity, there's no subjective or leadership that we can, that we can identify that has the task of kind of analyzing and, suggesting a direction to the movement. But we have had some list of demands, or some demands that have been circulating on social media, have been socialized as as a first draft of a possible list of demands. And it's quite it's quite evident, I think, that there's no demand, for instance, for changing the structure of the state from a unitarian state with a clear, I think, element of Persian supremacy, as it has been called by scholars of race in Iran. Not only Zia Ebrahimi is not the only one, but now this is the name that comes to my mind. So there's no conscious attempt from moving from this to, for instance, a federal or federalist understanding or configuration of the state. And and I've been reading interviews and different interventions, and I think Frieda as well, as we've all been following what's happening, not only in terms of current affairs but also in terms of intellectual production. And I think that there's an anti-intellectual attitude which is quite evident within the diaspora and the supporters of the movement, but also perhaps within the movement. And there's also some suspicion towards anything that is, let's say, or similar to a decolonial approach or a decolonial analysis. Therefore, one that tries to, foreground intersectionality and foreground different types of oppression, from, of course, class oppression, race, and gender, and all the rest and all the others, because I think this has been for a long time the kind of discourse that the regime has been adopting instrumentally. Of course, not that the regime is actually trying to do some decolonial work, not at all, but the language is very similar, and of course it's totally instrumental. So this this is a long way to say that I think there's still a lot to work on that, and unfortunately I see a resistance from within the movement to do that kind of work, which also includes self-reflection.
One of the things that occurs to me in that discussion is the comparison with Turkey and the way that Erdogan and others previously have, every time the Kurdish struggle has come up, there's been a deployment of nationalism that has very successfully worked against the Kurdish struggle in various ways. And I was wondering if the similar kind of dynamic in Iran, like if there is a nationalist discourse that can be, I mean, to the extent that the struggles do appear as related to Kurdish and other minority rights, that there would be either the actuality or the possibility of the regime using nationalism as a weapon against the struggles. I mean, I imagine. Okay, anyway, go ahead, Paola. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is in part what is happening. The accusation of being separatists and working against the nation, or the interests of the nation, or the unity of the nation, is definitely an accusation that the regime has been using, but also kind of tapping into, I think, some ancestral cultural anxieties, that the Iranian population as a nation, as the population kind of self-reflect upon itself and, conceives of itself as a nation, had. So yeah, I mean, but we also see it, in some expressions of solidarity that we have seen coming from the diaspora, from within the diaspora to protesters in Iran. Very often, the national element, even in the form of nationalistic songs or this kind of cultural produces are definitely at the center, of diaspora politics, and especially the mobilizations that we are seeing today in the diaspora. So I think this is something that is, nationalism is something that definitely is extremely central and extremely crucial, and culturally is particularly salient. So it is definitely something that the regime is using, and also I think a historical cultural obstacle that is making it difficult to make that to start with the kind of work that requires, deconstruction, self-reflection, self-critique, and so forth and so on, to surpass and really overcome a political imagination that is constrained within the nation state.
Frieda, I was wondering if it might be a point to bring you in on is about this question of the diaspora. Seems to me really interesting. I mean, I guess there are two sides to this, and maybe choose which one you'd that rather work through. One is the role of the diaspora in support of the movement and in just allowing for the recognition and information about the movement, etc. Because obviously people within Iran are very circumscribed, and it's of course dangerous to do so. But the other thing that seems to me to go together with this is because of the geopolitical situation of the last 50 years, it's impossible to have much faith in the international press, in the information we get. There's the constant complication of the U.S.'s relationship with Iran, and so the support that one sees of the U.S., of the protesters, always seems to feel horribly complicated, and a European support for them too. So I guess there's two sides of that. I don't know which one you could choose, one of them, or try to think about both of the role of the diaspora, and then the difficulty for us. I mean, I'm thinking, me personally, about, since I don't read Farsi, I get all my information via most really European and North American sources.
Okay, thank you for the questions, and I've really, really appreciated this conversation so far, and also really appreciated Paolo's very thoughtful and reflective responses. So about the diaspora has been very helpful currently. So I'm not talking about the part of the diaspora that's monarchist, but I'm talking about those who are really would like a democratic future for Iran, are not necessarily socialists, but are open-minded and believe in women's rights and human rights. Specifically, I would say the website Zamaneh, that's based in Holland, has been very effective. It's run by an Iranian intellectual philosopher named Mohammad Reza Nikfar, and most of its reporters are more recent emigres who are young and are very much in touch with the developments inside Iran. They have great connections, they have great reports, and they try to offer some reflection and some self-critique. And they're also very sensitive toward the issue of the rights of national minorities and feminism and LGBTQ rights. So I would highly recommend that site. They also have an English page. It's kind of limited, but it's still very useful. And then there are been a figure like Hamid Esmailion, who is a dentist who lives in Canada, and his wife and child were killed on a plane that was shot down by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in January of 2020, after when U.S. Missiles killed Qasem Soleimani, one of the main leaders of the main leader of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who was a butcher and a murderer involved in the Iranian intervention in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, everywhere, and internal repression. When U.S. missiles killed him, and of course I am not in favor of U.S. missiles killing anybody, but when that happened, Iran retaliated, and in the process of retaliation, they say accidentally they shot their own plane, a Ukrainian plane that was carrying mostly Iranian passengers out of Iran. And so Hamid Esmailion, who's this Iranian dentist in Canada, his wife and child were on that plane. And he has now become one of the leaders of the diaspora opposition. He organized some very powerful demonstrations in Europe and Canada of both Iranians and non-Iranians coming together to express their support for the uprising in Iran. And he's certainly not a monarchist, not with the Mujahideen Khalq, who get support from the United States. And he is a very open-minded and very, very democratic and supports all types of human rights. So that's been another expression of diaspora support. And then, of course, people abroad do read the BBC a lot, but the BBC is very mixed because they give just as much voice to the monarchists as they do to other forces, and they're not really critical of the monarchists. And they've also had some relationships with the Iranian government in the past, in the sense of maybe sometimes downplaying certain issues that they need to have covered more, or become more critical of. But in any case, the BBC is also a very important place where the Iranian diaspora goes for news, and also sometimes they interview people from our diaspora who are very interesting and have very great important views to offer. And then concerning the second question about the international press, I can't really give an overall response to that, because I mainly read the New York Times. And I think that the New York Times honestly has been very good in its coverage of Iran. One of the reporters, Farnaz, or the main reporter on Iran, is Farnaz Fasihi, is an Iranian woman who also has great connections inside Iran. And almost every few days, she has an article in the New York Times really covering some of the key issues. And so I think their coverage has been very good. But I think my main critique of their coverage of Iran, and also coverage by some other Western sources, is that they act as if it's Iranians out there who are fighting against authoritarianism. They don't make the connection to the struggles against authoritarianism in the West, and that we are also facing capitalist authoritarianism, we're facing religious fundamentalism, and we're facing assault on women's rights, on the racist assaults on Black people and people of color. They don't draw those connections.
Let me add something on this latter point. The public discussion of the movement in Iran happens in the West in the wider framework of the war in Ukraine, which means of a supposed clash between democracies and autocracies. I think that this framework obscures profound transformations of the international system. And so my question is, how do you see the movement in Iran in this wide framework, which is the kind of effect that the movement in Iran can have also beyond Iranian boundaries in a region which is quite conflict-ridden, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then the Gulf.
Who would you like to answer that question first, Sandro?
I think you, because you were talking about.
No problem. I'm happy to. So that is a really great question. Thank you so much. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I would call a genocidal invasion, is a very important factor here. Well, two specific aspects. One is that Iran is currently selling drones and missiles, long-range ballistic missiles to Russia, which Russia is using to destroy the infrastructure of Kyiv and even places like Lviv, which were up to some extent immune to the assaults, and really destroying the Ukrainian struggle for self-determination and resistance. Although the Ukrainians have been making great advances and have been able to push Russia back, but Russia is using those drones and missiles that it gets from Iran and also to some extent from North Korea to really destroy the infrastructure so the Ukrainians wouldn't have water or power. So Iran is indeed playing a key role in helping Russia's invasion. And but it's not only in Ukraine that Iran has had this role. Iran has been a major backer of the Assad regime in Syria with its Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, with the militia groups that it stands there, and of course the financial support. But without the support that the Assad regime got from Iran and also from Russia, that then ended up intervening through aerial attacks in September of 2015 and beyond, the Assad regime would not have been able to survive. Iran has had a major role in backing the Hezbollah and building and backing the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran has had a major role in Iraq in promoting a very sectarian Shia government and promoting a lot of discord and a lot of suffering. And so, and of course, Iran has also been involved in Yemen. Has its support the Houthis in Yemen. So in all these places, and of course another country that I need to mention is Afghanistan. Even though Iran was opposed to the Taliban, more recently Iran has had good relations with the Taliban, and of course since the Taliban came back into power in August of 2021, the relations have improved between the Iranian government and the Taliban. So if the Iranian government is indeed overthrown, if the Iranian regime is overthrown, and if all these ways in which it has been supporting militarism and death and destruction in the region are ended, it would have quite a healthful effect on the region as a whole and also on Ukraine.
I wanted to come back, Paola, to something that you said earlier, and about, you mentioned in passing an anti-intellectualism in the movement, and I thought that might, if I understood that correctly, but what I wanted to tie it to was questions about the internal organization of the struggles and what we know about it. I mean, I think it's natural or maybe inevitable in such a situation that those of us outside the country can have little understanding of the actual internal organization. But I guess I was wondering if those two things were tied together, the let's say the non-centralized nature of the organization as far as we understand, and what I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about it, what you meant by the anti-intellectual nature. I guess let me link that one more time just with something else, which is that it's clear, of course, as you said at the very beginning, that the spark that set this off was not only a feminist question but also a Kurdish question. That the slogan that the entire movement has adopted is of Kurdish origin, and I'm wondering the extent to which that one could think that consciously or not, the ethos or ideology or political sense throughout the movement is something that does, say, come from Rojava or could be related to Öcalan's thought or other Kurdish, that there could be a kind of, let's say, Kurdish intellectual origin of this. I might be skeptical about that, but I'm trying to think about what are the intellectual coordinates, even that might define this. So I'm putting together two things. I realize I'm being a little bit confusing. One is about organization in a political sense, and the other is about ideological political formation.
So I think there are many different ideological political formations that coexist in this moment. I think, and I don't know if there's one that is hegemonic in the sense that it's it's quite difficult from, at least for me, from outside, to map hegemony and where hegemony is kind of in the making, and then where if it moves and where to. But I think in this moment we have different types of of genealogies and formation co-present in the movement. And I think that about the anti-intellectualism. Sorry, let me go back to the first point, so I finish and then I go back to the anti-intellectualism. And some of these, let's say, ideological political formation definitely have their roots and bring on the thinking and, let's say, ideas and philosophy of the Kurdish liberation movement. But what we see in other localities of Iran, I think, is a different type of ideological political formation and kind of trajectory, which I think in part comes from liberal feminism, for instance. So the kind of history of the feminist movement that we have had in Iran, which in its hegemonic form, at least this is, how I see it, but in its hegemonic form has been in the past 4 decades predominantly liberal, so very much focused on, legal reforms and, Iran being part of international conventions for the respect of human rights. Not that those things are not important, but I think there has been, by this hegemonic formation of feminist politics, little effort to kind of integrate class consideration or considerations that have to do with the racial, or ethnic discrimination and so forth and so on. I think another ideological political formation is the kind of legacy of let's say, a kind of reformist movement. So the evolution and the radicalization of organizations that historically have been close and during specific times, like in the 90s, in the 2000s, also even cooperating and supporting the government. And I'm thinking here of the history of University Students Association, for instance. So I think in this moment we have many different actors and ideas coexisting and working together. But I think the larger framework is one of radicalization. I think that, and this is a major difference from the movements of the past, I think that what today we're looking at is a movement that includes very few people who think that actually the system is reformable and think that there's someone within the political elite who is actually listening to them. I think that that belief, that perception of being listened to, or having the hope that someone is listening to the protesters, I think that kind of attitude and understanding and perception is over in Iran. This is my, of course I might be wrong, but this is my analysis. I think that in that sense there has been a radicalization. In that sense there has been, a loss of hope, if you want, in the system and its ability to reform, which I see again as part of a larger global process, whereby we're looking at, even in the so-called liberal democracies, we're looking at systems that have become more and more authoritarian, that have become less and less tolerant of dissent and tolerant of public expression of dissent, and basically dispossessing the people of economic resources, political and civil rights, and so forth and so on. And in that sense, I see a clear connection also with the attempt at dispossessing women of their reproductive rights, or anyone with a womb of their reproductive rights. So in that sense, I see this as part of a larger configuration I was talking about before. Very quickly about the the anti-intellectualism. So I think this is the anti-intellectualism I'm thinking of. I think it's there, and I think it takes the form of a suspicion towards anything that is adopting or is sounds like leftist politics. And I think this is due to the fact that, the regime has been appropriating that language in an instrumental way. Absolutely. I'm not saying the regime is, is leftist at all, but, the anti-imperialist rhetoric, the rhetoric about the oppressed and the protection of the oppressed, and all that kind of, of linguistic kind of vocabulary has been mobilized by the regime. So I think it's very difficult to kind of make a distinction between between let's say the intention that are behind this vocabulary. So I think there's that. I think there's also the fact that the regime has been systematically targeting intellectuals, has been systematically targeting at anybody doing any sort of intellectual work, from university professors to journalists to lawyers to you name it, like to editors, writers, and so forth and so on. So I think there is, in that sense, I think this has caused a a problem, in the sense of having, unfortunately, the vast intellectuals in prison instead of outside of prison, trying to produce analysis and to and to think about and reflect. So I think there's that as well. So in that sense, I think, and then I've been reading and listening also to famous feminists in Iran, being, for instance, very suspicious of the term and the concept of intersectionality. Being very suspicious of that, or being very, just very suspicious of anything that has to do with, privilege, and has to do with deconstructing one's privilege, understanding it, and then trying to, to think through the categories of privilege and, intersectionality, and so forth and so on. Because I think I think it has a long history. If we look at, for instance, Frieda knows him, I'm sure, but Marandi, who's a well-known professor, who's often he studied in the US, comes from a very, big family. He speaks a very good English, so he's often called, by big media platforms such as Al Jazeera to comment on stuff, and he's definitely the mouthpiece of the regime. Like, he's really, it's very explicit in that, but he is mobilizing a language that we use as well. So I think there's a short circuit there.
Would you like me to respond to that question as well and follow upon what Paola said?
That's good. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you, Paola. I really appreciate what you just said. And just to add to that, I think it's true that basically after the late 1990s, when we saw a flowering of discourse in Iran for a period of, I would say 15 years. There was, or at least until shortly after the Green Movement, there was a lot of support for the possibilities of liberal capitalism, and the idea that, if we could just replace this government or this system with a liberal capitalist system, it would make things so much better. But I think that with the growth of authoritarian capitalism around the world, and the ways in which the countries that we have known as liberal capitalists are able to really confront the right-wing and the fascistic drive or reverse it, it's there have been a lot of doubts about whether liberal capitalism can be a successful alternative. At the same time, I think the degree of economic distress in Iran and the fact that so much of the middle class is now really living has the standard, the kind of life that they used to associate with the working class in terms of having very limited resources. There is more openness, I think, to the idea of a socialist alternative if it's expressed in a way that clearly distinguishes itself from the experiences of the USSR and Maoist China, which I consider to have been totalitarian state capitalist societies. And then within feminists too, although those who believe in liberal capitalism still have a strong presence, there is also more openness to the idea of feminism that's intersectional, that is addresses the issues of class, race, and gender at the same time. And it's toward that aim that I wrote a book just published last month entitled Socialist Feminism: A New Approach, where I try to analyze what's new in gender relations in the 21st century, what's new in authoritarianism in the 21st century and the struggles against it. I take up 4 different theories of women's or gender oppression developed by socialist feminists: alienation, social reproduction, intersectionality, queer theories. And I also take up socialist feminist ideas about alternatives to capitalism, both in the economic sense and in the sense of overcoming domination, the relationship of self to other. And had I not been an Iranian woman with the experience that I had from back in 1979, when I saw the Iranian women's demonstration against the religious fundamentalist takeover of the revolution get repressed, or had I not had the experiences that I've had in the past 40 years, both with the relationship to Iran and international feminism, I would never have been able to write that book. But I'm hoping that that book can change the discourse among Iranian feminists, and also between Iranian feminists and feminists internationally.
Can I say something? I feel a bit slightly guilty now, because I mean, I of course I have a great respect, and I do. I mean, there have been very, I mean, radical in the sense of, I mean, building an intersectional and emancipatory politics groups within Iranian feminism. I didn't want to kind of write them, you know, as all you know, non-aware or not interested in, you know, class, race, and all the intersections, but and of course the anti-capitalist politics as well. But yeah, thanks, Frieda, for, you know, for mentioning this.
But Paola, when you put together because it seems to be a consonance in the way you're describing it, between the decentralized nature of the organization of the movements and the, let's call it, deprivileging, if not undermining the centralized intellectual voices. I mean, it seems to me that the two potentially go together. You know, which is that there's not, like you're saying, that there's certainly an intellectual character of the movement and a theoretical character of the movement, but it might be one that doesn't valorize specific intellectuals in the same way that it doesn't have centralized or political organization. Am I right in understanding that you know, there could be a more distributed intellectual conceptual formation rather than centered around privileged figures of intellectual production?
Yeah, I agree with this. You know, and then I'd like to know also what Frieda thinks, but I do agree with that also, because it's, you know, those who have been in the past years recognized as, you know, intellectual and activist characters bringing forward the struggle, whether that's for, you know, women's rights, or that's for, you know, different dismantling, if you want, different types of injustices, are today in prison. I mean, there's also, you know, the intervention of, you know, the authoritarian states are really important, I think, to read the way in which activism, you know, organized as a field of action in Iran. I've been noticing how it's, you know, even the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and social capital is difficult in Iran, because you have a lot of people who get arrested, who have to go to, you know, to exile, and all different types of obstacle that actually makes it very difficult to build the kind of continuity. Of course, we do have a continuity, but it's not as I would say, as direct and as easily readable as, you know, we might have, for instance, in Italy, or I suppose in the US. So I think, yes, the fragmentation and dispersion are very important. I think intellectual instruments that we can use to read politics and activism in Iran.
Michael, would you please also restate your question, because I'm not sure I heard your entire question, the one you posed to Paola.
Yeah, well, it was really about what I perceive as the resonance or correspondence between the decentralized political organization of the struggles and the perhaps decentralization of intellectual production. You know, meaning that there aren't central figures that are, you know, like, for instance, you remember in 2011 in Cairo, the international press at least was each month saying that someone else was leading the struggle. You know, there were always leaders nominated, you know, even if they weren't really the ones doing it. But it's interesting that there hasn't been, over these 3 months, at least in my perception, the proposition of an organizational center. either a person or a party or something like that. And then similarly, there hasn't been proposed an intellectual leader of the struggle. And so I was reading Paola's way of describing the intellectual, I would say this is what Paola's revision seemed to me, a rich intellectual production without a recognizable intellectual figures, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, Frieda?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It does make sense. And I think Paola is also right about the fact that a lot of intellectuals are in prison, and there have been some barriers to the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. All of these are true. I'm trying to see how I would respond to your question from a different angle, which is that partly I think the fact that, I mean, in a certain sense, okay, it's good that we no longer have those centralized organizations that are very anti-democratic and top-down, and we certainly don't want those to come back. But at the same time, it seems that not just in Iran, but around the world, what has happened is that there's so much focus on decentralization that the idea that we need intellectuals to come together to develop ideas and analyses to help the movement go forward is really falling by the wayside. And any effort to do that is pushed out as authoritarianism sometimes. And it doesn't have to be authoritarian. I mean, we do need organizations of people who come together to offer ideas, analyses, rootedness in history, political economy, philosophy, helping the new generation connect to the, those ideas that have been developed in the past, and also lessons from the past. Most immediately, lessons, let's say, from the Arab Spring and from the destruction of the Syrian uprising. I mean, there are some huge lessons there, lessons from the Occupy movement and why that didn't succeed. We're not seeing that. And that's very, very problematic. I'm quite disturbed by it.
I'm totally in agreement with you about the usefulness of such things, but it's also true that such things have to arise from within. That as those of us outside have little ability to do that. But I also have faith that these things often exist in ways that aren't visible from the outside. That the forms of organization that are propelling a struggle like this can be not recognizable to those who are not part of the struggle themselves. And we might later learn exactly how because something as sustained and widespread and powerful as this current movement, I think, has to be organized. There must be organizational structures that are functioning. But in any case, I mean, I feel like us outside, we can learn from them, but we can't, in fact, do much for them.
Can I chip in? I totally agree. There are indeed organizations that have. I've been following them on, through social media. But for instance, the various student organizations, the various student trade unions have been developing documents, have been developing analysis. So we have, of course, that kind of intellectual work that comes from within. I was also thinking about something else, which I think is something that is also interesting. And in this seemingly absence of leaders, in the way in which in particular, the Western press is presenting the movement today. So no leader is mentioned, and so forth and so on. But we do have the prioritization, of some voices over others, especially, I'm thinking of, for instance, of, Masumeh Ali Nejad, who's been very much presented by the Western press as the leader of this movement. So it's also interesting, and I think we should put extra care in seeing how some voices and some positions are presented to us as as the leaders, and of course that's not necessarily correct from a ethical point of view, but also from an analytical point of view, is not necessarily something that makes us understand better what's going on, what are the really important voice that we should listen to. And of course, along with Masumeh Ali-Nejad, we have other voices. So for instance, the media in Italy have been, I think, out of ignorance as well, have been very much presenting the people's mujahideen, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, as the leaders of the movement, which is also pretty problematic. So I think this adds a kind of layer of complexity in the way in which we can read the movement, especially if we don't have a lot of knowledge of it.
I agree with you, and I wanted to second that, because, for instance, Masih Ali-Nejad had good relations with the Trump administration. So I think she completely discredited herself with what she did. And then Mujahideen al-Khalq, they're a group that they killed their own members. They had strong ties to the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. They get support from the United States. They are a totally authoritarian group. So I do not respect them in any way, and they do not represent the Iranian uprising. And at the same time, I wanted to go back to the issue of the intellectuals and activists who are in prison, that those who want to know how they can express their solidarity with the struggle in Iran, I think the most important thing they can do is to publish the cases of the Iranian feminists and labor activists and environmental activists and Kurdish, Arab, Baluch activists who are in prison right now. So many of them are in prison, and these are really precious people who, if out, can really help this movement go forward. Narges Mohammadi, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Zainab Jalalian, these are some of the feminists. Others, Atena Daemi, Sepide Qolian, Golruhi. I mean, I could just go on and on and mention so many others. The teachers, the leaders of the teachers union, the bus riders union, some of the Haftape workers, they're still in prison. So if people would like to go to my website, Iranian Progressives in Translation, I have many articles there that they can familiarize themselves with the human rights and progressive opposition inside Iran. Please do that. Please feel free to contact me. My email address is there.
Great. That seems like a perfect way also for us to end. I just wanted to remind everyone that both Frieda's and Paola's biographies and links are on the side of the screen of the YouTube, so you should be able to find everything there. And just lastly, I wanted to remind what I mentioned at the outset, which is that our next lab session, which will be on the 20th of December, is about Mexican strategies for abortion access in the past years. And we have with us for that day Amy Krauss and Oriana Lopez Uribe, and so I'm really looking forward to that discussion. But first, thanks so much to Frieda and Paola. I think this was really really great discussion and informative, helpful for me.
Thank you so much.